Somebody in the press asked him, well, why are you supporting Kim Campbell? He said, well, because she's tough, but she's fair. And I thought, well, I can live with that reputation.
With us today is the Right Honorable Kim Campbell, the 19th Prime Minister of Canada.
So you quickly learn, you're not the great person flying in to save them from themselves. No, you're their servant. You're the elected person whose job it is to try and make the laws and the policies of government work for people.
That is a very, very powerful quote.
You think you know a lot when you're running, and you think, I want to run and I want to do, and then you discover when you actually get in with the responsibility of making policy that there's a lot you don't know.
You also mentioned that your parents, they served in World War II.
But I felt that I wanted to do something bigger than my own life, that I wanted to also make a contribution and rise to some kind of challenge. Both my sister and I, my sister's 2 years older, we were raised to believe that girls could do anything. And my mother really encouraged us to be ambitious about our own abilities, our own ability to do things.
You were not afraid to take a challenge, and I find that incredibly inspiring.
So I think I'm a person of my time, that you can take risks. But you always survive. It's never the end of the world in terms of leadership. The most valuable currency you will ever spend is respect.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode on Female Empowerment, the podcast. With us today is from Canada, the Right Honorable Kim Campbell, the 19th Prime Minister of Canada. Ms. Campbell, we're so happy to have you here.
Delighted to be here.
While I read your biography, there were so many firsts. You were the first female Minister of Justice, the first female Minister of Defense, and not to say the first female Prime Minister, and up till now the only one. I found that really, really inspiring. My first question to you is, becoming the woman you are today, what was it that made and shaped you? Sometimes I personally find it's decisions, people, or situations that shape us and make us the woman that we are today. And I would really love to hear your story.
Well, Simone, it's interesting because I think we're all products of our time and place, where we grew up, when we were born, etc. I'm a post-war baby boomer. I was born in 1947, which was a time when certainly in Canada, the United States, lots of people were having children because after the war, people wanted to make up for lost time. So we were a big generation. We're sort of this big demographic lump that's gone through the population as we've aged. So, but at that time, World War II was probably one of the most dramatic things that happened in the 20th century. I mean, World War I was pretty terrible too, but World War II, it was recent, it was huge, it was important. And both of my parents were in uniform in World War II. My dad was in the Canadian Army, and he fought here in Italy, actually, and was wounded. My mom enlisted in the Navy in 1943 to train as a wireless operator to track the transmissions of German submarines in the North Atlantic and Gulf of St. Lawrence. The submarines can't communicate underwater. So as I was growing up, both my parents had had experience in the war. And happily we weren't at war anymore, so I didn't have to do that. But I felt that I wanted to do something bigger than my own life, that I wanted to also make a contribution and rise to some kind of challenge. And particularly in the post-war period, it was the question of establishing peace, the development of the Cold War, all of these kinds of things. So I really felt that I wanted to make a difference, and wasn't quite sure how to do it. And I didn't think about politics. Nobody in my family was particularly political. My parents were good citizens. They voted, but neither was involved in a political party particularly, or, activist in that way. So that wasn't a tradition in my family. But when I was a teenager, I had this idea that maybe I'd like to be the first woman Secretary General of the UN. And now that was a terrible, difficult job. But at that time, I thought, well, maybe that would give me something to do related to world peace. But if you'll notice, I said that I wanted to be the first woman doing that. And that's because both my sister and I, my sister's 2 years older, we were raised to believe that girls could do anything, but to understand that it wasn't necessarily a universally accepted proposition. And my mother really encouraged us to look out for female role models and to be ambitious about our own abilities, our own ability to do things. After the war, my dad went to university and became a lawyer. My mom got pregnant quite soon after. A show was set about my sister and me. We were unplanned but not unwanted. But it meant that she wasn't able to take advantage of the support given to returning veterans to go to university. But she was a very intelligent woman, very well read, very curious. So I grew up in a household that we had books. We weren't well to do particularly, but we had books. And as I say, my mother encouraged our curiosity. She was quite artistic. So I think I grew up in an environment where I was encouraged to think outside my own narrow social milieu, and where I wanted to make some kind of difference. And also how that manifested it also was I was the kind of person who would always kind of step forward to do something if something needed to be done and nobody else volunteered. I wasn't always the first one to volunteer, but if something needed to be done, I'd say, well, I could do that. And sometimes it meant organizing dance groups for my elementary school sports day or doing something else. But I was the first girl to be elected student council president of my high school. And young, women watching this today might think, well, that's sort of a strange thing, because nowadays girls and young women are very much involved in student governments, et cetera, in high schools and universities. But in those days, it was the spring of 1963. And the year before, a girl, as we were called ourselves in, ran for student council president, and she didn't win. And a lot of people said, oh, well, that's because girls can't be student council president. And I thought, well, that's sort of stupid. Of course they can be. So I ran, I wanted to make a point that they could be. And I had
and you made a point, yeah?
I had two male opponents, and I actually got more than half the vote. So they didn't just split the vote. I actually beat them, got more than half the vote. And it was a big deal because a reporter from the Vancouver Sun, the big newspaper, came to interview me. And there was a little article in the paper with my picture, and, he asked me, and how are you going to, control all those boys on the council? And I said, well, I'll have a big gavel. I mean, it was sort of a stupid thing. My greatest interview. But the point is that I guess I sort of felt that I wanted to stand up for girls, as we were then, and then women. And when I went to university, in my first year of university, I went to a special gathering. I think because I'd been president of my high school, I was invited to this thing called Frosh Retreat, which was for freshmen who might get involved in student activities, and they were to be encouraged. And there was a guy there who kept walking around saying, I'm going to be Frosh president. I'm going to be Frosh president. And I thought, well, you're kind of a jerk. I thought, maybe I'll run for Frosh. So I did, and I got elected. And then a couple of years later, I was vice president of the student council. And then I decided that maybe I ought to graduate. So I gave up that activity and focused on my studies. But my studies, I studied political science, and I went on to be a Soviet specialist because, again, interested in what was happening in the world and trying to find a way where maybe I could make some kind of difference. So I think I'm a person of my time, that it was a time, all of the thinking after World War II was such a terrible thing. How could we make sure it wouldn't happen again? What were the challenges? New challenges for girls and women, trying to open doors for girls and women. And those were important parts of my thinking and who I am. And I still work hard for the advancement of women. I still care a lot about international peace and democratic governance. So I haven't changed.
Yeah.
I'm just working at a different level.
What I got from when you told me your story is like, you were not afraid to take a challenge. And I find that incredibly inspiring, because sometimes, even nowadays, it can happen that women or girls, they sometimes see challenges and hurdles. It's like, should I take it? But your story proves it, that you can make it. And I find that makes a stand, you could say. You mentioned
I
that
wouldn't
your
want
parents...
to suggest that I never had any failures. I think it's important to understand that I was elected more often than I wasn't, but I did have some failures. And one of them I call my kamikaze run in Vancouver Centre, where I agreed to run in a provincial election when I really shouldn't have done it. So I don't want to, what I want to say to young women and young men and women, that you can take risks, but you always survive. It's never the end of the world, and you learn from your failures. And again, sometimes I was too willing to step forward when I should have said, no, let somebody else do it. I have something else more important to do. So I haven't always been wise about my willingness to step forward, and I admit that. That's important.
But failures are a part of life also. and sometimes they can teach you a valuable lesson, and next time it works out even better than you might have thought. Yeah. So challenges, taking risks, and also failures, as you mentioned, they're part of life. You also mentioned that your parents, they served in World War II. And my next question to you is, you mentioned in your book, Time and Chance, your political memoirs, you mentioned directly in a prologue that a political career, I believe you, robs you of your persona. You opted for a political or public office nonetheless. And my question to you is, do you think that your parents, that they served the country, kind of also inspired you to serve?
Well, I think so. I mean, I think that was just an example. But other things too. I had an interesting family. My grandmother, my mother's mother, was widowed quite young. My mother's father died when my mom was only 14, and her oldest was 16. So they lost their father quite young, and he was a wonderful man. And my grandmother had been a school teacher, but she had to give up teaching when she got married in 1921, because in those days, if you were married, you couldn't be a teacher. I guess maybe they thought, first of all, that they wanted to give the jobs to men. That often was the case. Although in the 1920s, because so many men had died in World War I, they needed people. But I think they were afraid, if you were a married woman, you might get pregnant, and what would the little
Mm.
children think? Ooh, we might have to tell them about, people were very prudish in those days. So the point I'm
Yeah.
making, though, is that after the war, in the early 50s, when the baby boomers, this big generation of post-war baby boomers, hit the schools, there was a great shortage of teachers. And my grandmother, then I think she was almost 60, went back to teaching. She took a refresher
Nice.
course, and she
Yeah.
didn't choose to teach city schools. She went to little communities in the province of British Columbia. And she would come back on the holidays, and we'd have all these wonderful stories of the places that she lived. One place she lived for a year or two in a place called Burns Lake, which was really the boonies, as we say in English. I mean, really very rural, very wild. She had to walk to an outhouse at night. At one time, there was a porcupine in the outhouse. So, by which I mean an outdoor toilet. So for somebody her age, she was remarkably adventuresome. And
Yeah.
she taught in a number of different places. And so that was also a very interesting example to me. I mean, for her, it was important also. I mean, I think she appreciated having the opportunity to earn a living. She'd been widowed and she had very small pensions, but so she was self-sufficient that way, which was a good example for me. But she, age did not deter her. And I think probably eventually when she turned 65, she might have had to retire. I don't know. But she got several years in of teaching, going back after having been out of the field for almost 40 years, or 30 years, which was really quite amazing.
Yeah, for sure. And I really liked hearing your story, your backstory, where you came from, the people that inspired you. But you also held, as I mentioned, public office. You were minister, prime minister, member of parliament. Did How were you prepared for these positions? Because there is not like a handbook directly written down, these are
So,
the steps that you take. And also most politicians, they often have an agenda, their own agenda. I read that as Minister of Justice, you had these meetings with other people. You heard to their stories and the challenges that they were facing to implement that when considering doing your job as Minister of Justice. Yeah. Uh, what prepared you for these positions or this time frame?
well, well, a couple of things. Aside from being the first woman to have ever been Prime Minister of Canada, I was the first Prime Minister to have held elected office at all three levels of government. So, as you'll see in my book, I started out being elected to the Vancouver School Board. And that was an interesting story too, because my first husband was on the school board, and he wanted to run for city council, and his colleagues thought maybe I should run because I was teaching the university then. And I said, well, I'd be interested in doing that because, I'm interested in how my students are prepared, and I would find that quite interesting. But of course, Campbell is my maiden name. It's the name I was born with, and it's the name I've always used professionally. And
Mhm.
they went, oh, because they thought if I used my husband's name, I'd get elected for sure because he'd been elected, and that I'd slide in on his coattails. But I wasn't going to do that. So anyway, he ran for city council, I ran for school board, each with their own names, and we both got elected. But I actually got more votes than he did. But anyway, but what I want to make is that at each level, I learned a lot. And one of the things I learned is that you think you know a lot when you're running, and you think, I want to run and I want to do, and then you discover when you actually get in with the responsibility of making policy that there's a lot you don't know. And one of the things that we used to do at the school board was we would have regular public meetings where people could come and make presentations to us. So that created a habit of listening to people and understanding that your view of how something might work might not necessarily be the experience that others will have, and that you needed to listen to people to really avoid making stupid mistakes or doing things with the best of intentions that turned out to be very destructive. So then I was in the provincial legislature, and again I got a chance to travel the province. I chaired a couple of committees. One of them was about amending something called the Builders Lien Act, which is a kind of an esoteric piece of legislation that protects tradespeople when they work on construction projects, to make sure they get paid. So I had to go around the province, talk to them, and also issues related to forestry. But the point is, as I went around the province and listened to people about, what their concerns were, how was the law working for them, how was it not working for them. First of all, I learned that people just hate talking in public. Most of the scariest thing for most people is public speaking. But if you get somebody talking about what they know about, they're usually very articulate. So you'll get somebody who's really, has never talked in a public meeting before, and then you say, well, Mr. Box or Ms. So and so, what would happen if we did this, or how is this working for you? Then you get them talking, and they're telling you all sorts of interesting things, and they're highly intelligent and very thoughtful about what they do. So you quickly learn, you're not the great person flying in to save them from themselves. No, you're their servant. You're the elected person whose job it is to try and make the laws and the policies of government work for people. And if you let them tell you what they need and how this would work or wouldn't work, you'll do a lot better job. So by the time I went to Ottawa as a member of parliament, first of all, I was the Minister of State for Indian Affairs and Northern Development. So I worked a lot with Indigenous people. Then I became the first woman Minister of Justice. And when I became Minister of Justice, I decided that I'd like to honor that by having a national symposium on women, law, and the administration of justice, to hear from women how the justice system was and was not working for them, because this was the criminal law, and it's a federal jurisdiction in Canada, so very important. But again, I had wonderful people I worked with in the department, and they went out and talked to what they called the stakeholders, all sorts of different people. I didn't know everybody to talk to. They went out and created this wonderful group of people who convened in Vancouver, and we even had some judges who came because they knew that because the minister was convening this, that their independence would be respected. And after the meeting, even some of the judges said, before I came, I thought I was pretty liberal on these issues, and I realized I didn't know anything, because they hadn't heard directly from women saying, here's how we feel, when we're, the victim in a rape case, and we're treated in this particular way when in sexual assault trials, where we become, the defendant more than the defendant, all of these kinds of things, or whether it's family law or any of these things. So again, I would reach out, and when I was dealing with my sexual assault law, because I did a major revision of the sexual assault law, we met with people who weren't what I would call the usual suspects. We met with all the, the Canadian Bar Association and the Law Society, and these various groups. But we also remember we went to Toronto, we met with a group of people representing women of color who talked about the different ways that the police interacted with their own communities when they had issues of domestic violence. We talked to women in the sex trade. We talked to gay and lesbian people. So, the point is that, I learned so much. And so when we were crafting the law, we had a broader understanding of how it really worked for people. And a couple of years later, the second woman to be Minister of Justice, who became a friend of mine, and this may have happened with other ministers, but she was the one that mentioned it to me. She said that when she became the Minister of Justice, she was being briefed by the department, and they said, would you like to follow the Campbell mode of consultation? And she said, well, what is that? And they said, well, Minister Campbell used to like to consult with people much more broadly than the usual groups that ministers consult with when they're considering legislation. And they explained to her how this worked, for example, when I was doing sexual assault or my gun control law. I created an advisory committee, and I had a firearms expert from Vancouver. I had an Indigenous person, because Indigenous people have rights to hunting and having firearms. I had somebody who was a
Mhm.
technical expert on firearms. I had somebody who was an expert on urban violence. So I brought these people together to be to make sure that I also communicated that I wasn't captive of any one perspective. That my goal
Mhm.
was to learn as much as I could to create a law that would really work for Canadians, that would make them safer, that would be workable, that would be intelligent and would reflect reality. So anyway, so she said yes, she would like to follow the Campbell mode of consultation, but I was
Wow.
amused to discover that my practice had remained in the department. But I think that was also, I mean, I passed a record amount of legislation when I was justice minister. And every time I'd have these difficult issues, like gun control, it's a very contentious issue in Canada. We don't have the same gun culture that Americans have. We don't have anything like
Mhm.
the Second Amendment. People think they have, but we have a lot of firearms and a lot of urban rural difference between firearm cultures of people who live in rural areas where they need firearms if they're attacked by a bear or if they go hunting or all of these
Yeah.
kinds of things as opposed to urban people. So there were a lot of these issues, but I passed a really remarkably comprehensive piece of legislation. And I remember the media were saying, well, how did she do that? Because I didn't run around going, I'm going to get my bill passed and, not get in my way. I was just quiet to talk about it, and I would work with people and I'd communicate with people and, try to create common ground. So when the bill passed, people said, well, how did that happen? They said, well, Mulrooney must have pulled her irons out of the fire, meaning the prime minister must have stepped in. But no, he didn't. He didn't pull anybody's irons out of the fire. You had to make your own, like you had to get it through, because you had to get through your own caucus of members in your own party plus the cabinet. So,
Yeah.
but I think that was why when the prime minister announced he was stepping down, so many members of my party and my caucus wanted me to be the leader. I almost didn't have a choice. And I knew it was very unlikely we could win another election because the sitting prime minister was very unpopular. Now, he just died a few months ago, and after all these years, people are much kinder about him. But when you're in public office, I mean, he made a lot of people didn't like him, and
Mhm.
we'd also been in government for 2 terms, and Canadians like to alternate their governments, and there were 2 other parties that had come up that were nibbling away at our vote, et cetera, in the West and in Quebec. So I knew it wasn't a very promising situation, but I almost couldn't say no because like one of my colleagues who was opposed to a lot of my stuff, some of my stuff on gay rights, and but the somebody in the press asked him, well, why are you supporting Kim Campbell? And he said, well, because she's tough, but she's fair. And I thought, well, I can live with that reputation. Whatever
Yeah.
happens to me. And I think that was the whole. But I told you this long story because these were things that I learned all the way up, starting at local government, starting then in provincial government, the federal. And part of it's a certain amount of humility, understanding that even if you have the levers of power in your hands, you don't know
Mhm.
everything. And for me, the worst
Precisely.
thing would ever be to discover that with the best of intentions, I had done something that was destructive or counterproductive. So you try and make sure that you're as well informed, but also when you have these consultations, you make people feel included.
Mhm.
With my sexual assault law, there was a group of women quite on the political left, and they didn't really trust me. I'm kind of a centrist, but they weren't sure that I would do the right thing when the Supreme Court struck down the rape shield provisions of the criminal code, and I was re-legislating, and they were convinced I wasn't going to do it right, so they were quite negative. And finally, I was able to gather them for a meeting and say, well, maybe you should hear what we're thinking of doing. I can't announce it yet because it hasn't gone through cabinet, but let me give you some idea of what we were thinking of. Well, they were totally astonished because it was everything that they wanted. So then
Yeah.
they turned 180 degrees and became very supportive. And when the bill finally passed, they, of course, took credit for it. I thought, well, that's fine. I don't have to get the credit for it. I mean, I obviously the minister who got it through Parliament. But the point is that when you consult with people, when you engage them, they'll stop fighting you, even if they don't get everything they want,
But
because
they
you
feel
validate.
heard.
Yeah. And that's what I would say, the bottom line and the most important thing, and I created a leadership college at the University of Alberta in 2014. And one of the things I used to always say to young people is, in terms of leadership, the most valuable currency you will ever spend is respect. When people feel you respect them, when they feel they are heard, they will often accept not winning the argument, because often they know that they don't represent the mainstream, that that maybe what they want is too much, or not ideal. Although I always tried to massage things to provide, I would always look for some principle. I remember once a woman saying to me, I think we should remove the presumption of innocence for criminals, for a sexual assault. And I thought, I don't know, my hair said it curled. I thought, I don't think we can quite do that. We have to keep the presumption of innocence and prove guilt in a trial. But I understood what her passion was, why she was so frustrated. But you try to find things that people say and validate them, recognize them, include them in what you're doing if you can. But if people feel heard, if they feel that you care enough to talk to them, and that you've tried, even though they haven't got everything they want, they won't fight you. They will actually support you because they feel respected. And it's not a matter of play acting. It's how you should function. Because you know what? You don't know it all. There's a lot of things, that I have had to unlearn in my life. Simple little bigotries that I had based on where I lived and what the world looked like around me. And I'm a much more open, much less bigoted person now, because I've just had an open mind and I've grown, and I'm much happier for it, because my life is full of wonderful, amazing people that I didn't know before. So I think that's a really important thing for people to bear in mind. Don't be afraid to expand your horizons, and don't assume that if somebody doesn't look and sound like you. My problem with the press when I became prime minister was that nobody who looked or sounded like me had ever done that job before. And for a lot of people who've been, covering the Ottawa politics for all their years, it was jarring to them. Like, who does she think she is? Where did she come from? That's not what a prime minister looks sounds like. Yeah, because nobody sounded. So the more unusual people or non-typical people who do things, the more they expand our sense of who might do them. Oh, so now that Kamala Harris is running for president, it's not so shocking as it might have been 20 years ago.
Because there have been other women as well, And
I think of somebody like Angela Merkel. When Angela Merkel became leader of the Christian Democrats, one of the members of my Club of Madrid, my organization of former presidents and prime ministers, I can't remember who it was, said to me, I said to him, the Christian Democrats have elected a woman as their leader. Germany could have a female chancellor. And he said, oh no. If they win the election, she won't be chancellor. And I said, well, how do you figure that? If she's the leader of the party, oh no, so-and-so will be the chancellor. He could not come to terms with the idea that a woman could be chancellor, because chancellors didn't look like that. They didn't sound like that. So yeah, she could be the leader of the party, but oh no, if they won the election, somebody else would be the chancellor. Well, by the time she stepped down, people said, and who was the chancellor before Angela Merkel? They remember. The point is that she had made it normal. And that's why I say, to young women, go for it. If you're the first, there are some human sacrifices. There are, people who, and what sexism isn't people running around and saying, I don't like women, because nobody will ever say that out loud. It's not politically correct. But they just never give you the benefit of the doubt. They apply a very high standard to you. And so there you are, you're trying to fight something, where your opponent is fighting a whole different battle. If he or she is somebody who is not atypical. But every time somebody breaks through those barriers and does it, you change the landscape from which people get their sense of how the world works. So it's not just Angela Merkel, there are many women in Europe who have led governments.
Von der Leyen, for example, or the president of the European Parliament, Roberta Metsola, there's so many. I don't know if we can imagine, they're like a symbol already, So they have clearly,
But it's also how they their shape, how they sound. We no longer, excuse me, we no longer think that that is not a leader.
mhm,
But for a long time, a leader was a tall man with square shoulders or a deep voice like this. And even if he was a complete idiot, we would
yeah,
think, well, that's a leader. And we've gone over a lot of cliffs following people like that. So the more people can judge based on intelligence and judgment and character, um, uh, the better for all of us.
very, very well said. Uh, one question before we go to another topic, and could you summarize your time as Prime Minister in one phrase?
Well, too short, but not inconsequential.
Okay. That's really to the point. Almost German, I would say. um, Going back to having a responsibility, you mentioned that briefly that it's kind of a weight to have a responsibility, especially in public office. Uh, how did you balance that? And what was your first thought when you became prime minister? Because that was like I would say, the highest of positions, but also responsibilities.
Well, the big moment was when I won. I was at the convention and won the leadership of my party because we were governing party. So I
Yeah,
immediately became the prime minister designate, and 12 days later I was sworn in. And I think it was kind of a sense of euphoria, the excitement of what that meant, and particularly when I saw what it meant to women, and not just women. I mean, I remember one of my supporters, a man, he had tears running down his face. He said, "This is for my daughter." A lot of men, want their daughters to have the opportunity to be everything
yeah,
they can be too. I thought it was really great, but it was, I think the most important thing is you try to have around you the people who can help you be wise, the people who can help you make the best decisions. You don't want people who will never criticize, but you realize when you get these positions, for example, when I became prime minister designate, I had to create my own cabinet, which meant I now had the power to determine which of my colleagues would be cabinet ministers. And that's a changed power relationship that I hadn't had before. And
yeah.
you suddenly realize that you will never have the same relationship with them again, at least not as long as you're prime minister, because of that power relationship and how you have to handle it with such tact and care, and that you're bound to disappoint some people, because one of the things I wanted to do was to make the cabinet smaller, so there were fewer positions. And the cabinet I created, it was very popular, but there were a lot of people who were disappointed. So I realized that I was going to have to uh, deal with those downsides, that it wasn't just a honeymoon,
Yeah.
wonderful forever.
Can't
No,
make
I was going to
can't make everybody
make
happy.
no, have to make some tough decisions, and you make them as wisely as you can, and
Mhm.
uh, and then you stand by them. But
Yeah,
if you're not motivated by jealousy or wanting to get even with somebody, like I never felt if somebody didn't support me for the leadership. Once the leadership campaign was over, that was it. That was over. We were all colleagues again, and there was no difference between those who supported me and those who didn't, um, in the sense that we were all on the same team. Um, but there are a lot of people, who carry a grudge, and
yeah.
you
Sadly, yeah.
can't do that. The best thing you can do, and I say this to young people watching, if somebody hasn't supported you, but you've nonetheless won, spend the rest of the time trying to show them why they should have supported you and why it was good
That's a good
that,
one.
that you came out on top. Don't deepen their views that they were right not to support you by being a jerk. No, rise above it and become the person, so that they can then say, well, I didn't support her for leadership, but I'm very glad she won, or I think she's doing a very good job.
That is a
And
very, very powerful quote.
Yeah, but
Would
it's
you say,
also
is
true,
there one? Yeah, sorry. That is
I
another
think
question I would.
if you're constantly trying to get even, or you bear grudges, it'll wear away at you. If you're in a
Mhm.
position of responsibility and leadership, you need your energy. You need to be able to
For
sleep
sure.
at night. You need to be able to deal with crises. And if you are wasting your energy going to bed, you know, you can't do it. You have to say, okay, living well is the best revenge. I won. I'm the leader now. Now I have to show people that that was a wise decision of our party to choose me and that I can fulfill their expectations. But one of the ways I will do it is by asking for their advice, asking for their help. People love to be asked to help.
That's
And
true.
and you're kind of not to ask them because you might not always agree with the advice they give you. But sometimes if they give you some advice that you weren't expecting, you'll sit up and go, oh, I hadn't thought about it that way. Or not sure I want to do that, but isn't that interesting that that's what they've said? In other words, you should never be afraid to hear things that aren't an echo chamber of what you're already
Yeah.
saying.
No, I completely agree. Thank you for sharing that quote. We always have on our Instagram the cover of the new episode and also a quote, and this quote is for sure making it on there. Thank you so much for sharing it. We talked about balancing the responsibility, but I have one particular, and also making decisions that sometimes are difficult to make. And it's quite a direct question. Has there ever been a decision that you found very, very hard to make during your time as Prime Minister?
Indeed, we had a couple of candidates who were under investigation for how they handling their campaign funds, etc. And there were, I think, three of them. And one of them had been one of my strong supporters, and he was later exonerated. But and the other two were one was later found liable for doing it, and the other one, I forget what happened to him. But I had to face the decision whether I would approve their candidacy in the upcoming election. And my predecessor had one of his vulnerabilities is that a lot of people didn't think he was always completely honest with things. Whether that's fair or not doesn't matter. But it was one of the weaknesses or the vulnerabilities. And you know that integrity in politics is very important. And so the press were bothering me, kept saying to me, was I going to sign off on their candidacies? And the one person who had been my supporter, I spoke to him about it, and he said, Madam Campbell, he was from Quebec, I'm happy to step down because I realize it's a problem. So he stepped down. And the other two, I basically said I couldn't approve them. One didn't run, the other ran as an independent and actually was elected from his riding. But it was very difficult because the question was, should I stand by them? Mm-hmm. Or, what is it? Nobody has a right to be a candidate for any party. And the leader has the ultimate say in whether somebody will be approved. And given the history of the things that people didn't like about our leader and the very short period of time before we actually had to go to an election, because my predecessor waited to the very last minute to leave, I made that hard decision, and it was very difficult. Although during the campaign, a number of the candidates said to me, thank you so much for doing that, because before that, people were, giving me a hard time when I was going knocking on doors. And this way, it removed that issue from people holding it against us. But it could have gone either way. But because people say, well, you're innocent till proven guilty. Yes. And I wasn't saying that anybody was guilty. I was saying that if there is a cloud over someone's reputation, they need to clarify that before they stand as a candidate for our party in an election. But it was very hard. It was very hard because personally, I liked particularly the one person who was actually the most amenable to making it easy for me. I felt bad, but my obligation was to the party as a whole. Mm-hmm. So that was, I think, one of the hardest things I had to deal with. And again, because we were so close to having to be in an election, because there wasn't any time to wait out things to see how they turned out.
Yeah. You were the next question is, having had these positions when you left public office, do you continue to have an eye, because you have balanced the responsibility, the obligations for so long? Is it easy to just step away and say, now it's free time, now it's, because I also saw you continue to be active in politics, and I find that so impressive. For example, the Council of, hang on, I wrote it down. The Council of Women World Leaders, the International Women's Forum, Club de Madrid, as you mentioned, Harvard University. Can you tell us more about this time? But also, is it difficult to just leave the obligations behind, to just be free to say?
Well, first of all, when you get defeated in an election, it's not your choice whether you leave the obligations behind.
Okay.
You have retirement thrust upon you. When people say to me, do you miss politics? And I say, I miss making real decisions. There's something very energizing and exciting and challenging about being where the action is and having to wrestle with important problems. And I found that very energizing. And my mother used to say, you thrive on stress. It doesn't bother you. I find it, because it's the challenge of figuring out how to deal with things, how to answer questions. But when I was defeated in 1993, I knew that meant the end of my political career. And that made me very sad, because it was a terrible defeat. We had two other parties that were eating away at our vote. So the party that won actually made a majority government with only 38% of the vote. And I kept our core vote, but in the West and in Quebec, we lost votes. And it was very devastating for me. And I felt bad for our candidates who had lost. But once I kind of licked my wounds, and incidentally, the Institute of Politics at the Kennedy School at Harvard has a lovely program. They call it the fellowship for what they call people in transition, which often means people who've just lost an election. And their idea, is very smart, is to get them down to the Kennedy School to meet with students, to have some time to think through what they want to do next, maybe begin to write a memoir or whatever they're going to do, but also to share their experiences with students at the Kennedy School of Government, so that they can, provide really fresh and direct input to them. And so I went there in January of 1994, and I found that very helpful. And then I went back in the fall. I was asked to come and be a fellow at the Joan Shorenstein Center on the Press and Politics. And that gave me an interesting opportunity to look at the press coverage of my election and come to understand how sexism plays out. And so I'm not saying that as a way of blaming, but just to watch the double standard. And incidentally, that there was a double standard was a theme in the coverage that people kept writing. There's a real double standard, Kim Campbell said such and such, and we jumped all over her. Jean Chrétien said the same thing, and we left him alone. Gee, that Jean Chrétien sure can manipulate the media. No, but he was seen to belong. They knew him. And even if he put his foot in his mouth, well, that's just Jean Chrétien misspeaking. But anytime I did anything, it was like, a federal case, capital punishment, off with her head.
You're perceived different.
So, yeah.
Also,
so I had a chance to study it in a more. And what I did was I looked at the press coverage of the campaign from the perspective of what journalists said, not what I thought, but how journalists described the coverage. And that was what was so interesting, was how journalists described it as very biased and unfair. So
yeah. But psychology also says that people perceive men and women differently. So there is truth in what you say. It's been proven. I think it's take like a few seconds for us to, let's just say, to judge a person. That's just how you perceive them, and there are differences. We cannot get around that.
Well, it's interesting, because as I began to build my post-political life, and I went for 4 years to Los Angeles as Canadian Consul General in 1996, and that was interesting, because it was a chance for me to go someplace and use my experience for the good of Canada. That being a former prime minister as consul general there, I could get into every door. I was able to do a lot of good things to serve my country, and that was very good. And that's actually where I met my current husband. But I also did a lot of writing and reading and thinking about this burgeoning body of social psychological, social psychology and cognitive psychology research that came out of the 1990s about stereotypes, implicit attitudes, how people think. There was a woman at Harvard who then went on to win the Nobel Prize in economics recently, Claudia Golden, who wrote a famous article about the way symphony orchestras audition for new musicians. And what she found was that when symphony orchestras audition behind a screen so that the people auditioning and judging can't see who's playing, they hire many more women. But in addition to looking at these practices, she interviewed a lot of conductors. And, and she would say to them, well, what do you think about, men versus women, musicians? And they would often say, oh, well, women have small technique. Well, if you think somebody has small technique, that's what you'll hear. But if you can't see who's playing, all you hear about is the actual playing. So you don't bring to it your implicit attitudes because, we think, oh, well, if you heard it, there'd be no doubt about it. But no, we impose, we project on people what we expect from them. So yes. A man and a woman can say the same thing because we expect a man to be intelligent. They'll say what he said was intelligent. The woman says the same thing and we think it's not intelligent. But there's a whole body of wonderful research. So when I went back to the Kennedy School after my diplomatic post, I went back first to be a fellow and then to teach at the new Center for Public Leadership. I was able to teach a course called Gender and Power and bring in a lot of this stuff. And years later, when I created a leadership college at the University of Alberta, the same thing, trying to help students understand that the way we think isn't really how we think, and that there are a lot of barriers to making good decisions, not all of them relating to implicit attitudes and biases, but also decision-making biases, things like confirmation bias, and all these things that keep us from processing information in a way that leads to the best decision. So it's sort of disappointing to learn that, our brains are not working as wonderfully well as we think they are, and that we're not, reading the situation empirically and honestly. But in fact, we all carry with us all sorts of pre-existing attitudes and projections, which then goes back to this point that I make about the only way to change that is to change the landscape from which people get their sense of how the world works. And when that landscape is populated by a lot of different kinds of people, men and women, people of color, people of, different abilities, etc., then we get a different sense of who belongs. But if our landscape, when I grew up in Vancouver, my landscape was quite narrow. It was mostly white people, and all the positions of power were held by men. So I wanted to do things, but I wasn't even sure about other women. It wasn't until I got into my 20s that I realized, I wasn't the smartest girl around. Because people would say to you, oh, Kim, you're so smart. I mean, not like the others. And you'd go, oh, yeah, well, poor others, but I'm smart. Because that's how people hive you off. They let you excel without having to change the basic structure, like changing the basic system. And it's only when you stop and you realize, oh, wait a minute, I'm not the smartest girl around. I'm smart. But there's plenty more at home like me. There's lots of really smart women. And, I'd like to think I was the only one so that I could be unique and be the star. But as long as that's the case, I'm never going to be secure and comfortable in my position because I'll always be there on sufferance. I'll always be there as the anomaly, as the exception. And I should be there as just the ordinary person, the ordinary, smart, able woman.
Very well said. Is there one political or one advice that you would give concretely to women who are seeking a political career or a career in public office?
Go for it.
No, that's short, simple, on the point. I love it.
No, but go for it. It matters. Yes, understand what the difficulties are and be prepared to meet the pushback, although there may be less now than there was years ago. But understand that it matters. It matters physically your presence to be seen, but also that men and women often experience the world differently in a lot of different areas. And not all women experience the world the same way. I was a white, middle-class, university-educated, baby boomer, urban woman from Vancouver Centre. I could not speak for every woman in Canada. So having me in Parliament or having me on the school board didn't say, okay, now we have a woman, we can check that out. No. You had me and all the things that I brought and my willingness to reach out and hear the realities of other people. I mean, I certainly tried to do that, but I could not ever encompass all of the realities of women's lives that we need to take into account when we're figuring out how to run the world. And
Especially
so,
in that
that's
aspect,
why,
yeah.
yeah. So I say to women, it matters that you're there. It matters
Yeah.
that you're there physically to be part of this landscape, that you belong, and that people in public life look like you look like them, and there should be
Yeah.
more that look. But that also how you see the world and your experience, and is an important part of the big picture, and you can make a contribution to creating wise public policy. And you need to be heard, as well as need to go out and listen to more people.
That is very true. I often hear people saying, "Well, politics, I don't think that's for me." And I say, "Why is not isn't? Do you think it doesn't affect you? The politics affect everyone, and if you're a cashier or wherever you work, it doesn't matter." So it's so important that you share your point of view from your reality, and that you are part of it. Yeah, as you mentioned.
Well, I think one way to look at it is to say politics is for everybody, but not everybody will participate in the same way. Some people will run for
Yeah.
office. At the bottom line, we should all vote. We should see it, our right to vote is something very precious, and we should make an effort to cast our ballots in an informed way.
Yes.
If we want more women in politics, write a check, send a contribution to a candidate to help them support their campaign. Talk to your friends, volunteer to go canvassing, to do phone banks, to get the vote out on election day. There are a lot of things that you can do, but
Yeah.
see yourself as an engaged citizen. So don't say, I'm not interested in politics. You should be interested in politics, but that doesn't mean you have to be a politician. And
No.
it isn't for everybody. But if even if you don't want to be a politician, you should care a lot about who does get to be a politician in your community. And if you know
Yes.
somebody that you think would be wonderful, then you should encourage that person to do it. And if you know somebody who would be a complete disaster, then you should, work very hard to make sure that person doesn't get elected, by supporting somebody else. So it does matter to you, but there's many different ways to be involved, and it's all part of being a good citizen and understanding. We talked about World War II, and in your country, in my country, I mean, this was a terrible time. And terrible sacrifices were made and terrible things happened. But big prices were paid to get us where now the old enmities are gone and the old enemies are working together. And one of the things they're working together around is shared respect for democracy and the rule of law. That's what brings us together. And a desire never to let bad things happen. And incidentally, lots of things that Germany, bears the burden of. But there's a lot of interesting movement now looking at the impacts of colonialism, so that people in Britain are, starting to realize that they're, Britain rules the waves and the sun never sets on the British Empire. That those things covered a lot of injustices and oppression that happened in the name of colonial rule. So there's none of us who is exempt from having to look clear-eyed at our country's history, and not to run around flagellating ourselves, but to say, good people can do bad things. And how do we create a society where we protect ourselves from that? And the rule of law is one of the most important things. And and governments that will uphold the rule of law, and laws made with justice and fairness in mind. That's how we can help protect ourselves from ourselves letting people bring out the worst in us, because we all are capable. People can push our buttons. That's why whenever I
Yes.
see a demagogue, I say, "What's a demagogue? He's trying to push my buttons." And we all have buttons you can push. Then I would joke to people, "I'm from British Columbia, the Western province in Canada," and we often feel that there's an American Canadian comedian named Rodney Dangerfield, whose favorite line was, "I don't get no respect." And I used to say, the British Columbia, we were the Rodney Dangerfield of Confederates. We didn't get no respect, but all the money and the power was in central Canada. There we were at British. So if you wanted to make me mad, you could point out things, and you could press my buttons and get me angry. But then what? Then how do I solve the problem? Much more important to run for parliament, and to go articulating British Columbia's point of view, British Columbia's interests, making sure that we were heard and listened to, and that the policies of the Canadian government respected my part of the country as well as other parts of the country. And of course, when you get there, you have people from all over the country, and you realize, it's a big country, and you got to listen to a lot of different people and try to balance all that
For
interests.
sure.
But when people are pressing your buttons, trying to make you angry and rile up your anger, you're always going to have criminals and bad people. But don't let people let you vilify and demonize people. Use your fear to do things that are inhumane and that are wrong. At the Democratic National Convention, there were 5 young men who were there who had been wrongfully convicted of a murder in New York Central Park. And it was a terrible thing because, there was nothing that linked them to the crime, but people wanted to be. And well, later they discovered that it wasn't, these men had nothing to do with the young man. Another guy who finally confessed and whose DNA linked him to the crime, it was the murder of a young woman. So these young men were finally exonerated, and they were there at the Democratic National Convention. One of them is now a member of the city council, I think in New York or one of the boroughs, because they were a perfect example of what happens when people allow their biases and their anger. And this can happen in law enforcement. There's very, very many examples, of, policemen who think they can tell when somebody is telling the truth. And, and to force confessions out of people, false confessions are fairly common if people are,
pushing them.
Intimidated. So what I'm saying is that, if we allow people to press our buttons and manipulate us with our anger, terrible injustices can happen. And so we have to always be on guard not to let that happen. And it can be hard sometimes. But we know in around the world the examples of what happens when we don't put the rule of law and our democratic principles front and center. And the thing is that the people in the country that are involved, they carry that burden for generations. It's not, it's a very destructive and despicable thing to do. So we're the front lines.
Yes,
just us normal people as voters.
And that's why it's important to inform ourselves when casting the vote, for sure. Last but not least, before we go into the more informal part, is what are you most looking forward to at the moment?
Well, I'm actually thinking about creating a kind of a blog, and I'm trying to decide to do that. One of my friends last year was describing, we were talking about how old we are now. I'm getting old. And she said, people our age, we're sort of in the departure lounge. And I thought that was a lovely expression for people who are sort of in your later part of life. You're not, you still have a few good years left, but you're sort of in the departure lounge, sort of thinking about what you want to do in those last years that are available. And one of the other things when people say to me, what are you up to now? I say, I'm trying to be a good ancestor. I'm trying to think of things that I can do which will contribute to the betterment of life for young people. And I'm involved I sit on a global commission on climate overshoot. I'm very engaged in the whole issue of climate change with the Club of Madrid and other organizations. I'm involved in, trying to promote and support democratic development. So I'm trying to think of what are the things that I can do. I can't save the world. I'm, going back to when I was a teenager, I wanted to be the first woman Secretary General of the UN. I mean, actually, the current Secretary General is a good friend of mine, and it's a very hard job. I don't delude myself that one person can save the world, but we can each be a tile in the mosaic of progress. If we see ourselves as just one tile, that we will do our best, and we will try to speak up when we should speak up, that we'll try to support things and perhaps be sources of knowledge. I think one of the things that's very important to me is that I've always been a teacher. I was a professor at the university. Then I became a lawyer, but my whole approach to politics was also kind of pedagogical. I always felt that people could understand anything if you explained it to them and defined your terms. And my goal was always for the public to understand what the choices were, to be able to say, here's why we're doing this, and explain it in terms that were comprehensible, not with dumbing it down, but just speaking in the language that non-specialists would use to understand something.
Yeah.
So I'm always looking for some way to be a force for good if I can be, and often I'm also cheering on other people that I think are forces for good. And I think that what you're doing is great. I mean, all people who want to reach out and communicate in ways that their audience hopefully will be enriched by and will be able to take ideas away. And maybe it's not everything that you say, but maybe one idea will stick to you.
Yes,
And
precisely.
so that's my goal. But I guess I'm hoping to be a good ancestor and to not waste the time I have, uh, realistically understanding my limitations, but also realistically understanding how much good you can do if you care about it, and that
Mm-hmm.
when people come together uh, to make the world a better place, they honestly can help to do that.
Yes, yes, I do believe that. That's why working together is so important. As you mentioned, you are a piece in a bigger mosaic, and know what you can do, and together you can for sure achieve something. Thank you so much. We're now going over to the more informal part where we want to get to know you and your personality a bit better. And it's in the motto of fast question and answer. So the first one is in 3 words, how do your friends and family describe you?
I don't honestly don't know the answer to that. I know they think I'm funny. Um,
Hmm?
I think they think I'm kind because I do care about people. Um, busy. That's how they describe me.
Yeah, that is, I think those are quite good characteristics for somebody who is in public office.
Mm.
Hypothetical speaking, if you hadn't chosen the political career and you had instead to choose a hobby, again, this is hypothetical speaking, as a professional career, which one would it be?
Well, I play the cello badly, and if I could have done it really well, I would have really enjoyed that. So,
Oh,
but
cello,
being
that
a musician,
sounds, it's for sure a wonderful instrument. You can have it in a orchestra, but also as a solo instrument. My mom used to play
well,
it, but she was not that good at it. Sorry. Yeah.
but it's the closest to the human voice, I think, the cello, and it really is a very moving instrument.
Oh, for sure, it's very, very moving. That's true. Has there been a memorable experience that you would say it has been the one that impacted you the most?
I've thought about. I mean, and again, I've lived such a long life. I've had a lot of very impactful experiences in my life. Um, I think. Um, I think I just think that so many of the people that I met, um, things that sort of encouraged me to uh, keep going. But what was so impactful? Oh, maybe becoming prime minister was well because for the rest of my life I'm the former prime minister. If I'd not done
Mm,
that, that would not be a title that follows me around. So I have to
yeah.
try and respect that. So I guess becoming prime minister was pretty impactful, even if I wasn't there all that long.
Could you share your philosophical view on life?
Well, I think I'm cautiously optimistic. I think what we do matters. I'm very worried about the future. I'm worried about resurgent authoritarianism. I'm worried about climate change very, very much. But I also think it's important to foster your own resilience. There's a sometimes when you get older, you suddenly realize that the things you did in school make sense, and all of the poems that you had to learn, etc. And in English language schools, we used to learn poets. One of them was John Keats, and he wrote a poem called Endymion that starts out, "A thing of beauty is a joy forever. Its loveliness increases. It will never pass into nothingness, but will keep blah, blah, blah." And the whole poem is about how beauty can help to give you resilience and protect you from bad things, from when you encounter bad people, etc. But having beauty in your life can help to give you the strength. And I think that's very important. I think that, and I say this to young people, building your resilience, because there are lots of bad things happening in the world. You know, you've turned on the TV and the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza. I mean, there's all sorts of terrible things. And it's not that you use beauty as a way of ignoring those things, but it's a way of reminding you what the world and what human beings can be and why you need to hang in there and try and make it a better place. So I've been so lucky in my life. I grew up in a very beautiful place. I mean, Germany is a very beautiful place. Lots of wonderful natural beauty. I'm in Italy right now where I'm surrounded by natural beauty, surrounded by art, music,
Oh yeah.
all of the so things
Italy is quite
that
good at that, yeah.
yeah, but to give you resilience and to understand that life is very challenging now. And for your generation and the generations to come, there are huge challenges. But to feed your soul and feed your capacity to still care, to love people and see beauty. I mean, human relationships, friendships, these kinds of things. And I think of so many people I know that I admire who are strong and kind and wonderful. And that's what enables me to get up in the morning and continue in my very small way to try to do something, as I say, to try and be a good ancestor, to try, to make the best of my time. But I think you have to cultivate it. You have to work at it. And if there is something that you love, an art form or a hobby or something that gives you joy, you need to hang on to that, because that's what will also give you the strength to endure the difficulties that life will invariably present to you.
Yes, yes, very well said. The next question is there a historical person that you would like to meet for coffee? Or tea,
Well,
if you
there's all
prefer
sorts.
tea.
I mean, I always thought I'd like to meet Queen Elizabeth I, that she would be interesting for me. She was a very interesting, she was one of the most learned women of her time. She wrote
Yeah.
poetry in Greek for fun. But she also, talking about encountering sexism, and after she died, there was a whole industry of people writing about how she wasn't really as good as everybody thought she was. And a few years ago, a British writer named Paul Johnson wrote a book called Elizabeth I, A Study in Power and Intellect, where he wrote about how people were always trying to, diminish who she was, but that she was really a very extraordinary person. So I think it would be kind of fun to meet her and talk to her and find out about the challenges, how she dealt with the men in her court, and how she managed to stay on top for all of her life.
The conversation would be really, really impressive and interesting for sure. A book you read that after finished reading it, it still moved you.
Yeah, there's so many of them.
My questions are kind of mean because you have to pick from really many.
Well, yeah, I mean, it is very, very difficult, because a lot of books do stay with me. I read fiction, I read nonfiction. Well, one book, I would say Margaret Atwood's book, The Handmaid's Tale.
Oh,
Margaret
yeah.
Atwood's a Canadian, and of course, when it became dramatized on television, it became much better known. But it really stayed with me. First of all, because it takes place in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in a Harvard Yard, actually, is where and when I read it, because I'd spent time at Harvard, I recognized the physical characteristics of where all of this takes place. And the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, our CBC, had a program they started called Canada Reads. And I was part of the first episode where they took 5 well-known people and gave each of us a book that we had to advocate for. And then people would vote for it. And at the end of the 5 weeks, everybody in Canada was supposed to read this book, whatever. And I had The Handmaid's Tale. And I didn't win. And I don't know whether for people, when I would say that this book was so prescient, this was like in about 2000 or 2001 that I've seen it. And it was written in 1985. And and I was trying to say, this book, what it's describing, there are so many aspects about it that are real and that are warning, and nobody wanted to read it. But of course, as Margaret Atwood would say, there's nothing in that book that she didn't take from a real true life example. And but it stayed with me for a long time. And it's interesting how it then, when it was dramatized, became even more famous. And the term "Handmaid's Tale" or "Handmaids" has become a kind of
Yeah.
a short term to describe these kind of cultural values of seeing women only in terms of how they serve the men in
Yes.
their society and birthing. So I would say "Handmaid's Tale" was something that really stayed with me, um, and still does.
It's a really good book. Is there a topic that you could hold a 1 hour long PowerPoint presentation on?
I could probably do a PowerPoint presentation on climate change. I
Mhm.
could do a PowerPoint presentation on leadership, because I created a college on leadership, and in particular on uh, what we need to know about the way we think isn't really how we think. I could do a presentation on that. I could do, I was a political science teacher. I could do a presentation on lots of themes in political science, on
Yeah.
ideology, and Soviet government and Canadian government, I guess. So wind me up. I could do a lot of those things, but that's because I've been a teacher for much of my life. So I've got lots
If
of
you ever give
PowerPoint.
if you ever give a course again, please let me know. I would love to attend.
To do something online so everybody could join.
Yes, that would be amazing. I also read that you enjoy music and theater. In your personal opinion, I mean, I know we talked about Margaret Atwood, but is there a Canadian, no, it's not, doesn't have to be a Canadian, but a composer or author that really captured Canada's soul, the essence of Canada? Again, it doesn't have to be Canadian.
Um, well, there are a lot of people. There was a wonderful singer and songwriter named Stan Rogers who died tragically young, 30 years ago. And he wrote wonderful songs. They were played in a kind of a folk music style. If you go online and Google him, Stan Rogers,
Mm-hmm.
Canadian
Okay.
singer, he wrote wonderful songs about historical events and things. And I think he captured so much of Canada, our history, and uh, he wrote a wonderful thing. That was it. About a farmer writing about the hardest of his life and about his wife, and um, I don't know. He just captured so many things about the Canadian experience. And very sadly, he was on a plane flying back to Canada from Cincinnati, and
Mm-hmm.
somebody smoked in the bathroom. This was before where people still could
Oh,
smoke on planes. And I think they
yeah.
threw a cigarette or he was flying to Canada. The plane actually had to land in Cincinnati and started a fire. And
Oh
then
no.
when they opened the door, there was a big wave of fire and he was killed. And it was such a loss because I thought that he was such a voice. And there was also a wonderful radio presenter named Peter Zosky, who had a program on the CBC called This Country in the Morning. And I once said to Peter, if you were a singer, you'd be Stan Rogers. He thought that was a very great compliment. But he used to bring people, he used to have this morning show on the CBC. He was in Toronto. But he brought the whole country together. And listening to that, I would, meet people from all over Canada. People, they felt like they were in my neighborhood. He would have really interesting people talking about things. And so he wasn't an artist as such, but he was an artist of
Mm-hmm.
of the radio, and creating these wonderful sound landscapes of people doing things. So he is somebody else I also think of. He has died since he lived a little bit longer, but he was a big smoker, died of lung cancer. But Peter Zosky is in GZOWSKI. His ancestor was a Pole who had come over to Canada when they brought a lot of Polish and European work people to build the great canals in Eastern Canada, the
Mm-hmm.
stonemason people who brought those skills. And that was the origin of his name. But so The singer Gordon Lightfoot also had a wonderful capacity to capture that.
Wow. Thank you so, so much, Miss Campbell, for taking the time to talk to us about your life, the challenges you faced, and more importantly, how you overcame them. I really find your view on, or like your perspective on life so enriching and really inspiring. So thank you very much for sharing it. And on this note, to those of our listeners who want to know more details of Miss Campbell's life, she has published her political memoirs, and the book will be linked down below. And yeah, I can only encourage you to take a look. It is really, really an inspirational story. So on this note, thank you again, Miss Campbell, and we wish you all the best.